The sand was still settling when Lieutenant Kestrel, Raven, Marchenko received the call that would redefine everything the 3rd Battalion thought they knew about close air support. The convoy had been rolling through the Helmand corridor at 8:47 hours, 23 vehicles carrying medical supplies and ammunition to forward operating base Seraphim, when the first RPG shrieked across the morning sky. The explosion tore through the lead MRAP's front axle, sending the 6-ton beast lurching sideways into a drainage ditch. Within seconds, the desert erupted. Small arms fire poured from compounds on both flanks, the distinctive crack of AK-47s mixing with the heavier thump of PKM machine guns. The convoy commander, Captain Torres, watched his world collapse into chaos as tracer rounds drew luminescent lines through the dust-choked air. Back at Kandahar Airfield, Raven was in the ready room, halfway through a protein bar that tasted like cardboard mixed with false promises, when the alert klaxon split the afternoon quiet. She was on her feet before the second tone, her flight suit already half-zipped, helmet in hand. The briefing was brutal in its simplicity. Troops in contact, immediate CAS required, all other assets committed elsewhere. She would be going in alone. As she sprinted toward the flight line, the operations officer's voice crackled through her earpiece with coordinates and a single word that made her blood turn to ice water: ambush. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a prehistoric predator, its GAU-8 Avenger cannon jutting from beneath the nose like a promise of deliverance. Raven completed her pre-flight in 4 minutes flat, her hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had made this machine an extension of her own nervous system. The twin General Electric turbofans spooled up with their characteristic high-pitched whine, and she was rolling before the crew chief had fully cleared the wing. Tower gave her immediate clearance, and the heavily loaded aircraft clawed its way into the Afghan sky, every hardpoint loaded with ordnance that could turn the tide of a battle or end it entirely. What nobody at Kandahar knew yet was that Raven Marchenko carried more than just weapons on this sortie. She carried the weight of 14 months of doubt, whispered conversations that died when she entered rooms, and the constant unspoken question that followed her through every briefing: could a woman really handle this mission profile when it mattered most? The convoy didn't know her gender. They didn't know her call sign's origin or the scars hidden beneath her flight suit. They knew only that help was coming, somewhere in that crystalline blue sky, and that their survival depended on whoever was flying that aircraft arriving before the ammunition ran out and the desert claimed them all. The radio crackled with desperate voices as Raven pushed the throttles forward, the desert landscape blurring beneath her wings. Captain Torres' transmission cut through the static, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the hell unfolding around him. Any station, this is Vanguard 6, troops in contact, grid November Delta 734, 218, taking effective fire from multiple positions. We have casualties, require immediate air support, how copy? The strain in his voice was audible beneath the discipline, each word weighted with the knowledge that his Marines were dying in the dirt while he spoke. Raven's jaw tightened as she checked her fuel state and weapon systems, the heads-up display painting green confirmations across her visor. The A-10 was never built for speed, but Raven coaxed every possible knot from the airframe, flying low enough that her shadow raced across the wadis and villages like a dark omen. She had studied the terrain during countless mission briefs, memorizing the compound layouts, the irrigation patterns, the roads that weren't really roads but smuggling routes worn into the earth by decades of conflict. Now that knowledge crystallized into tactical geometry as she approached the kill box, her mind calculating angles of attack and egress routes while her hands remained steady on the stick. The radio came alive again, this time a different voice, younger, edged with panic barely contained. Vanguard 6, this is 2-3, we're pinned down hard. They've got us in a crossfire, Peterson's hit. We can't move him. She toggled her radio. Vanguard 6, Raven 1-1 inbound your position, 4 minutes out, authenticate Bravo Zulu. The response came immediately, Torres reading back the proper authentication codes, his relief palpable even through the encrypted channel. Raven 1-1, Vanguard 6, authenticated, situation critical, enemy forces occupying compounds north and south of our position. Estimate 20 to 30 fighters. They knew we were coming. That last phrase hung in the air like an accusation. Someone had talked. Someone had sold out the convoy's route, timing, composition. It didn't matter now. What mattered was the Marines bleeding into the Afghan soil, and the fact that Raven was their only hope for survival. As the battlefield materialized on the horizon, Raven could see the smoke rising from the destroyed MRAP, thin columns of black against the pale sky. She descended to 3,000 feet, the altitude where the A-10 became a surgical instrument rather than a blunt object. Her targeting pod came online, infrared sensors painting the world in shades of thermal signature. The convoy was a tight cluster of heat sources, vehicles arranged in a defensive circle that was rapidly becoming a tomb. Surrounding them, muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers in the compounds Tors had identified. Raven's thumb hovered over the weapon selector, her breathing controlled, her mind entering that state of hyperfocus that made her one of the best CAS pilots in theater, despite what the doubters whispered. Vanguard 6, Raven 1-1 has you visual. I count 5 distinct firing positions. Confirm you want me to engage danger close. These compounds are within 150 meters of your position. The silence that followed lasted only heartbeats but felt eternal. Then Tor's voice, steady as bedrock. Raven, we're combat ineffective if you don't. They're going to overrun us. Cleared hot on all positions. We'll mark our location with purple smoke. Through her sensors, Raven watched as a canister sailed from one of the vehicles, erupting into a vivid plume that stained the desert wind. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously, the way it always did in these moments, when lives hung on the precision of her next actions and the reliability of machines pushed to their operational limits. The A-10's cannon was a masterpiece of engineering violence, capable of firing 65 rounds per second of 30mm depleted uranium shells. Raven selected her first target, a compound's northern wall where her sensors showed the heaviest concentration of enemy fire. She rolled the aircraft into a shallow dive, the world tilting as the targeting reticle settled over the structure. Her finger squeezed the trigger, and the GAU-8 roared to life with a sound like the world's largest zipper being torn open. The recoil was so violent it actually slowed the aircraft, each shell streaking downward to impact with devastating precision. The compound's wall simply ceased to exist, transformed into a cloud of pulverized mud, brick, and shattered timber. The fighters inside had nowhere to run as the line of destruction tracked through their position with methodical efficiency. She broke left, pulling hard to avoid ground fire, the airframe groaning under the G-forces. Small arms fire rose to meet her, green tracers arcing upward in graceful curves that masked their lethality. Several rounds struck her armored tub, the titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit earning its reputation as pilot armor. The impact sounded like someone throwing gravel against a garage door, sharp but ultimately ineffective. Raven's hands never wavered as she repositioned for the second attack run, targeting the southern compound cluster where her sensors showed another concentration of heat signatures. Vanguard 6, first target neutralized, rolling in on southern position. Keep your heads down. Tor's response was drowned out by the thunder of incoming fire from his position, Marines finally able to return effective fire now that one flank had been silenced. The second run was a textbook demonstration of precision attack. Raven walked the cannon fire through 2 adjacent compounds, the shells ripping through walls and windows with equal contempt for cover. Secondary explosions blossomed as ammunition cook-offs added to the destruction, flames leaping from shattered doorways. Through her pod, she saw thermal signatures scattering, fighters breaking and running toward the wadis. She switched to her Hydra rockets, ripple firing a salvo that transformed their escape routes into fields of fragmentation and fire. The Mk-82 bombs remained on their hardpoints, held in reserve for hardened targets or troop concentrations. But so far the cannon and rockets were proving sufficient to dismantle the ambush. Banking hard, Raven acquired her third target, a compound with a heavy machine gun position that had been systematically shredding the convoy's vehicles. She could see the muzzle flash through her targeting system, could calculate the trajectory of those bullets finding marine flesh. Her approach angle was steep, aggressive, the kind of dive that pushed the A-10's flight envelope but delivered maximum accuracy. The cannon spoke again, and the machine gun position vanished in a fountain of earth and shattered concrete. For a moment, silence fell across the battlefield, broken only by the wind and the crackle of burning vehicles. Then Tor's voice, thick with emotion barely contained. Raven 1-1, Vanguard 6, that's 3 positions eliminated, enemy forces breaking contact. You just saved our lives. But Raven wasn't done. She climbed back to altitude, her eyes scanning the terrain for fleeing fighters, for reinforcements that might be moving to support the ambush. Combat experience had taught her that battles weren't over until every threat was eliminated or driven so far away they couldn't reorganize. Sure enough, her sensors picked up a technical truck racing along a dirt road 3 kilometers north, heavy machine gun mounted in the bed, heading toward the convoy's position. She didn't request permission, didn't waste time with radio calls. The Maverick missile left its rail with a whoosh of propellant, tracking on infrared signature, closing the distance in seconds. The technical disappeared in an orange fireball, the shockwave kicking up a perfect ring of dust that expanded outward like a halo. Circling overhead, Raven maintained her station, eyes constantly moving between her instruments and the ground below. The convoy was reorganizing, Marines pulling their wounded into the surviving vehicles, establishing a defensive perimeter that would hold against any further attacks. Medical evacuation helicopters were already inbound, their encrypted transmissions confirming Raven's work had bought enough time and security for the rescue to proceed safely. She checked her fuel state, calculated her loiter time, and settled into a racetrack pattern above the convoy. Nobody was dying on her watch today, not while she still had fuel in her tanks and rounds in her gun. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and lethal, witness to a battle that would be documented in after-action reports and whispered about in ready rooms, the story of the lone A-10 pilot who refused to let a convoy die. As the medevac birds touched down, Raven finally allowed herself to breathe fully, the tension in her shoulders releasing slightly though her vigilance never wavered. Tor's voice came through one final time, different now, stripped of the professional distance that usually characterized pilot-to-ground controller communications. Raven 1-1, Vanguard 6, I don't know who you are, but you just performed a miracle down here. 7 of my Marines are alive because of your actions today. We're forever in your debt. She wanted to respond with something appropriately humble, something that deflected the praise in the way she'd been trained, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply acknowledged, Vanguard 6, Raven 1-1, just doing my job. Get your people home safe. The flight back to Kandahar passed in a blur of adrenaline come-down and systematic aircraft checks. Raven noted every gauge, every indicator, the familiar ritual helping to ground her after the intensity of combat. The desert below had returned to its deceptive tranquility, showing no signs of the violence that had erupted across its surface. As she approached the airfield, Tower directed her to a specific taxiway, unusual for a routine recovery. When she shut down the engines and climbed from the cockpit, a small crowd had gathered, maintenance crews and operations personnel who had monitored the entire engagement on radios and data links. The looks on their faces were different from what she was accustomed to, the usual skepticism replaced by something that might have been respect, or at least the beginning of it. Captain Tors and 3 of his Marines arrived at Kandahar 8 hours later, medevac having diverted to Bagram first to stabilize the wounded. They came looking for Raven, finding her in the squadron spaces reviewing gun camera footage for the mandatory after-action documentation. When she looked up and saw the tall, weathered Marine captain standing in the doorway, his desert uniform still stained with blood and dust. Something unspoken passed between them. He didn't salute, didn't stand on ceremony. He simply extended his hand and said, "I needed to see the pilot who saved my Marines. Thank you doesn't cover it, but it's all I've got." Raven shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip, seeing the exhaustion and grief in his eyes for the men who hadn't made it despite her best efforts. What happened next spread through Kandahar airfield like wildfire, that particular brand of military gossip that travels at the speed of rumor but carries the weight of truth. Torres and his Marines spent 3 hours with Raven, listening to her talk through the engagement, watching the footage, asking questions about angles of attack and ammunition selection. They were professional soldiers seeking to understand the mechanics of their salvation, but they were also men humbled by the skill and courage they had witnessed. When word circulated that the pilot who had single-handedly broken the ambush was Lieutenant Marchenko, that Raven 11 was a woman who had been fighting for recognition in a community that too often valued tradition over competence, the reaction was mixed but undeniable. Some refused to believe it. Others simply shrugged, as if gender had never been relevant. But most, especially those who had listened to the radio traffic and heard the controlled professionalism in her voice while death filled the sky, began to reconsider their assumptions. The squadron commander called her into his office the following morning. Colonel Haversham was old-school Air Force, a former F-15 pilot who had initially opposed women in combat roles but had the intellectual honesty to change his views when confronted with evidence that contradicted his prejudices. He gestured for Raven to sit, his face unreadable. "I've been reviewing yesterday's engagement. The gun camera footage, radio transcripts, Tor's preliminary report. Lieutenant Marchenko, what you did out there was exceptional close air support. Textbook doesn't even begin to describe it. You made instantaneous decisions under fire, engaged danger close without hesitation, and eliminated multiple threats while preserving friendly forces. That convoy would have been overrun without your intervention." He paused, letting the words settle. "I owe you an apology. I haven't always been your strongest advocate. That changes now." Raven sat quietly, unsure how to respond to praise that felt both long overdue and slightly uncomfortable. She had never sought recognition, only the opportunity to do the job she had trained for, to prove that competence had no gender. Haversham continued, his voice softening slightly. "Your call sign, Raven. I never asked about its origin. Care to share?" She hesitated, then nodded. "My grandmother was Lakota Sioux. She used to tell me stories about the raven as a trickster and a messenger, a bird that could move between worlds and transform situations through intelligence rather than brute force. When I started flight training, it felt appropriate. Everyone expected me to wash out to fail, to prove that women couldn't handle the pressure. So I became the raven, the unexpected element that changes everything." Haversham smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "That you did, Lieutenant. That you did." The story of the Helmand ambush and Raven's response began to circulate beyond Kandahar, carried through official channels and unofficial networks, debated in ready rooms from Qatar to South Carolina. The gun camera footage became required viewing at the Air Force Weapons School, studied for its demonstration of effective CAS techniques and aggressive tactics. Instructors pointed out how Raven had maintained situational awareness while engaging multiple targets, how she had adapted her approach based on real-time threat assessment, how she had pushed her aircraft to its limits while never exceeding them. What some of them struggled with, though they wouldn't admit it publicly, was reconciling their preconceptions about female pilots with the empirical evidence of Raven's competence. The footage didn't lie. The after-action reports couldn't be dismissed. The Marines who owed their lives to her actions weren't going to remain silent about who had saved them. Torres became an unexpected advocate, speaking openly about the engagement whenever asked, never failing to mention that the pilot who had performed with such skill and courage was Lieutenant Kestrel Marchenko. His testimony carried weight in military circles, the credibility of a combat veteran who had looked death in the face and been pulled back by the pilot everyone said couldn't handle the pressure. Other ground commanders began requesting Raven for CAS missions, her reputation for precision and aggression under fire making her a valued asset. The squadron's scheduling officer found himself fielding unusual requests, specific call signs being demanded for operations, and Raven's flight hours increased accordingly. She flew mission after mission, each one adding to her combat record, each one executed with the same professional excellence that had defined the Helmand engagement. But success bred resentment in some quarters, particularly among pilots who felt their own accomplishments were being overshadowed by the attention paid to Raven's achievements. The ready room conversations took on an edge, subtle comments about favoritism or media attention, suggestions that her missions were being cherry-picked for maximum visibility. Raven ignored most of it, focusing on the work, on the ground troops who depended on her, on the aircraft she flew with growing mastery. She had learned long ago that proving herself was a continuous process, not a single event, and that some minds would never be changed regardless of evidence. What mattered was the mission, the Marines and soldiers who went home to their families because she had been overhead when hell erupted around them. 6 weeks after the convoy ambush, Raven was on station over a village in Kunar province when the call came through that would cement her legend and finally shatter the doubts that lingered. A special forces team had been compromised during a high-value target raid, surrounded in a compound with enemy reinforcements closing from 3 directions. The radio transmissions were terse, professional, but underlying them was the unmistakable recognition that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The team leader, a veteran operator with multiple deployments, gave Raven the authentication codes and then said something that made everyone monitoring the operation take notice. "Raven, I heard what you did in Helmand. We need that same energy right now. You have full authority to engage, no restrictions, save my team." The compound was in the center of the village, stone walls and narrow alleys creating a maze that made conventional attack runs nearly impossible without significant collateral damage. Raven studied the geometry through her targeting pod, calculating angles that would allow her to engage the advancing enemy forces without hitting the friendlies or civilian structures. It would require precision that pushed beyond standard operating procedures, weapons release parameters that existed in the gray area between acceptable risk and recklessness. She made her decision in seconds, the same instinctive calculation that had served her in Helmand. "Copy all, I'm rolling in, 30 seconds, mark your position with IR strobe." Through her sensors, she saw the infrared beacon pulse to life inside the compound, a single point of reference in the complex terrain. Her first pass used the cannon with surgical precision, walking the 30mm shells along a dirt road where thermal signatures showed enemy fighters advancing. The destruction was instantaneous, bodies and weapons scattering under the onslaught. She pulled up hard, repositioning for the second run, targeting a group of fighters attempting to flank the compound from the east. The Hydra rockets streaked downward, their fragmentary warheads detonating in a pattern that eliminated the threat while leaving the adjacent structures intact. The Special Forces team leader's voice came through, calm but impressed. "Good hits, Raven, enemy forces pulling back from east and south. We still have a heavy concentration to our north, approximately 15 fighters moving through the orchard." The orchard was the problem, trees providing both cover and concealment, making target identification difficult and collateral damage likely. Raven knew that a conventional attack would require multiple passes, time the team didn't have. Instead, she did something that would be discussed in tactical seminars for years afterward. She brought the A-10 down to 500 feet, flying directly over the orchard at near-stall speed, her cannon depressed at maximum angle. The targeting computer screamed warnings about minimum altitude and optimal attack profiles, but Raven's hands remained steady. She fired a sustained burst, the shells shredding through the tree canopy and impacting the ground in a line of devastation that stretched the length of the orchard. The enemy force disintegrated, caught in the open with nowhere to hide from the aerial onslaught. It was aggressive to the point of recklessness, a tactic that violated multiple safety protocols, and it was exactly what the situation required. When the Special Forces team extracted 15 minutes later, every member intact despite the overwhelming odds, their commander personally requested a meeting with Raven. Unlike Tors, who had been grateful and somewhat awed, this operator was analytical, dissecting the engagement with professional interest. "That last run through the orchard that wasn't in any manual I've read. You improvised that." Raven nodded, waiting for criticism. Instead, the operator smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered face. "That was the most aggressive CAS I've seen in 3 deployments. You saved my team by being willing to think outside the constraints everyone else accepts. Whatever doubts anyone has about your capabilities, they're idiots. You're the real deal." The recognition spread differently this time, not through official channels, but through the tight-knit community of Special Operations Forces who shared information through their own networks. Raven's call sign started appearing in target packages, specific requests for her to be on station during high-risk operations. The ground commanders had made their judgment, and it was unambiguous. They wanted the pilot who would push the envelope, who understood that sometimes survival required aggression that exceeded peacetime standards. The Air Force senior leadership took notice, her personnel file growing thick with commendations and letters of appreciation from ground force commanders. But more importantly, the whispers in the ready room changed tenor, skepticism replaced by a grudging respect that acknowledged what could no longer be denied. Her squadron mates began treating her differently, the casual dismissiveness evaporating as mission after mission added to her combat record. They asked for advice on CAS techniques, studied her gun camera footage, tried to understand what made her approach so effective. Raven shared what she knew without arrogance, walking younger pilots through decision-making processes and tactical considerations. She had no interest in being seen as exceptional because of her gender, only in being recognized as a skilled pilot who happened to be female. But she also understood that her success opened doors for those who would come after, that each mission flown well made it harder for the skeptics to maintain their prejudices. The burden of representation was exhausting, but she carried it willingly. The deployment wound toward its conclusion, months of combat compressed into a mental catalog of close calls and successful engagements. Raven had flown 93 combat sorties, expended thousands of rounds of ammunition, brought troops home alive who should have died in the Afghan dust. Her aircraft bore the scars of multiple ground fire impacts, each patch of repaired titanium, a testament to battles fought at altitudes where the enemy could reach back. The maintenance crews treated her bird with particular care, taking pride in the aircraft's combat record, adding kill markings to the nose with her approval. It was a gesture of respect, acknowledgement that the machine and its pilot had become legendary within the small world of forward-deployed combat aviation. The night before her rotation home, Raven stood on the flight line under the Afghan stars, the same crystalline sky she had fought beneath for months. The A-10 sat silent in its revetment, weapons pylons empty, ready for the next pilot who would strap into the cockpit and take the war to the enemy. She placed her hand on the fuselage, feeling the cool metal beneath her palm, remembering every mission, every close call, every voice on the radio calling for help that she had answered. Someone approached behind her, footsteps crunching on the gravel. It was Haversham, the squadron commander, his own deployment ending. "Hell of a tour, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "You changed a lot of minds, mine included. More importantly, you saved a lot of lives." Raven turned to face him, seeing genuine respect in his expression. "Sir, I just did what I was trained to do, what anyone in the squadron would have done." Haversham shook his head. "No, Lieutenant. What you did was exceptional, and pretending otherwise doesn't serve anyone. You proved something important out here, something that needed proving." The question was never whether women could fly combat missions. It was whether the military culture could evolve enough to recognize competence regardless of who demonstrated it. You forced that evolution, mission by mission, one saved convoy at a time. He extended his hand, and she shook it, feeling the weight of his words settle on her shoulders like an invisible burden she would carry forward into whatever came next. The flight home was long, commercial aircraft packed with troops and contractors, everyone suspended in that liminal space between war and peace. Raven sat by a window, watching the landscape change from desert to ocean to farmland, her mind struggling to process the transition. Combat had a clarity that peacetime lacked, immediate problems requiring immediate solutions, life stripped to its essential elements. She wondered how she would adjust to a world where death didn't arrive on supersonic trajectories, where every sound didn't trigger threat assessment calculations. Other veterans slept around her, exhaustion and relief mixing into expressions of peace she hadn't seen in months. She envied their rest, even as her mind continued to race through mission replays and tactical what-ifs. Stateside, the reception was muted, not the homecoming parades of previous generations, but the quiet acknowledgement of a volunteer force that deployed and returned without fanfare. Raven's family met her at the airport, her mother's embrace lasting long enough to communicate everything words couldn't, her father's eyes bright with pride and relief. They didn't ask about the deployment, respecting the invisible wall that separated those who had been there from those who hadn't. The drive home passed in comfortable silence, the familiar landscape of suburban America feeling alien after months in Afghanistan's stark geography. That night, lying in her childhood bed, Raven stared at the ceiling and listened to the absence of explosions, the quiet so absolute it felt oppressive. Reintegration was harder than she anticipated, civilian life operating at a different tempo, with different priorities, concerns that seemed trivial measured against the life-and-death stakes she had grown accustomed to. She attended mandatory counseling sessions, filled out forms about her mental health, sat through briefings about PTSD and readjustment. The counselors meant well, but they couldn't understand what it felt like to be responsible for lives measured in seconds, to make decisions that determined whether mothers received flags or welcomed sons home. Raven went through the motions, checking the boxes, knowing that her real processing would happen internally in her own time through her own methods. The nightmares came as expected, replays of missions where she arrived seconds too late, where her aim was off, where the enemy won and the Marines died. She woke gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat, her heart racing with phantom adrenaline. Time would dull the intensity, she knew, but the memories would remain, filed away in the mental compartment where warriors stored their wars. Her new assignment was to the weapons school, the Air Force's elite institution where she would train the next generation of combat pilots. It was recognition of her accomplishments, validation of her skills, and a burden she accepted with mixed feelings. Teaching meant reliving the experiences, breaking down instinctive reactions into step-by-step processes others could learn. It meant being scrutinized by students and fellow instructors, her every word and action evaluated through the lens of her gender and combat record. But it also meant shaping how the next generation thought about close air support, about pushing boundaries, about what was possible when competence and courage intersected. She approached the role with the same dedication she had brought to combat, determined to pass forward the lessons earned in blood and fire over Afghan skis. The students arrived expecting a legend and found instead a pilot who deflected personal glory to focus on tactics and techniques. Raven's classes were intense, technically rigorous, demanding excellence without accepting excuses. She used her own gun camera footage sparingly, preferring to highlight mistakes rather than successes, to show how close calls resulted from poor planning or execution rather than enemy capability. Some students struggled with having a female instructor, their preconceptions warring with the evidence of her competence. Raven ignored the whispers, the occasional eye rolls, the questions designed to test her knowledge rather than expand their own. She had fought this battle before and would fight it again, proving herself through performance rather than rhetoric. Those who came to learn left with new skills. Those who came to challenge left humbled. In the second year of her instructor assignment, Raven was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy, addressing a mixed audience of cadets and senior officers about women in combat aviation. She almost declined, uncomfortable with public speaking and wary of being reduced to a symbol rather than a pilot. But her commander convinced her that her story needed telling, that representation mattered, that the next generation deserved to hear from someone who had proven what was possible. She prepared carefully, crafting remarks that balanced personal experience with broader themes, avoiding both false modesty and arrogance. When she stepped to the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, male and female, she felt the weight of expectation pressing down like G-forces in a tight turn. Her speech was straightforward, lacking the rhetorical flourishes of professional speakers, but carrying the authenticity of lived experience. She talked about the Helmand Convoy without dramatization, describing the tactical decisions and their consequences, the weight of responsibility that came with being the only asset available when lives hung in the balance. She spoke about the doubts she had faced, the constant pressure to prove herself, the exhaustion of carrying not just her own reputation, but the hopes of everyone who looked like her and wanted to serve. But she also talked about the Marines and soldiers who hadn't cared about her gender, only her willingness to fly into danger on their behalf, the ground commanders who judged her on results rather than chromosomes. She concluded simply, the question isn't whether women can handle combat aviation. The question is whether we as an institution can evolve beyond outdated assumptions to recognize that excellence has no gender. I hope my career helps answer that question for those who come after. The applause was sustained, genuine, and she saw tears in the eyes of some female cadets who perhaps had doubted their own paths until hearing confirmation that success was possible. Senior officers approached afterward, some to congratulate, some to argue, some simply to shake her hand and acknowledge that their minds had been changed by her example. Raven handled each interaction with grace, deflecting personal praise to focus on institutional progress, refusing to be positioned as exceptional so that all women in combat roles could be seen as capable. The Academy's commandant pulled her aside before she left, speaking quietly so others couldn't overhear. Lieutenant Marchenko, what you've done extends beyond your personal accomplishments. You've helped shift our culture toward merit-based evaluation. That's as important as any combat mission you flew. Years passed, her career progressing through assignments that took her from instructor to operations officer to squadron commander, each position adding layers of responsibility and authority. Raven never forgot the lessons of that deployment, the understanding that leadership meant being willing to shoulder burdens others couldn't or wouldn't bear, to make decisions in the absence of perfect information, to accept the consequences of choices that saved some lives while failing to save others. She mentored young pilots without regard for gender, pushing them all equally hard, demanding the excellence the mission required while acknowledging the humanity beneath the uniforms. Her squadron became known for its performance, for tactics that pushed boundaries while maintaining safety, for a culture that valued competence above all other considerations. Those who served under her command often noted that she never asked them to do anything she wouldn't do herself, that her combat experience informed every decision without overwhelming it. The call sign Raven became legendary within the close air support community, spoken with respect by those who understood what it represented. Aggressive tactics tempered by precision, courage demonstrated through repeated exposure to danger, professionalism maintained under conditions that broke lesser pilots. New students at the weapons school studied her missions, dissecting her decision-making, trying to understand what made her approach effective. Some focused on her technical skills, the way she manipulated the aircraft to achieve effects others couldn't replicate. Others emphasized her tactical judgment, her ability to read battlefield geometry and exploit enemy weaknesses. But the best instructors understood that Raven's true genius lay in her synthesis of skills and mindset, the way she approached each mission as a unique problem requiring creative solutions rather than checklist compliance. When she was promoted to colonel and given command of an entire wing, some saw it as overdue recognition while others viewed it as political correctness elevated to policy. Raven ignored both perspectives, focusing instead on the 2,000 personnel now under her leadership, the aircraft that needed maintaining, the missions that needed flying. She brought to Wing Command the same approach that had served her throughout her career: clear expectations, honest feedback, intolerance for mediocrity balanced with patience for honest mistakes. Her wing achieved the highest readiness rates in the Air Force, not through shortcuts or statistical manipulation, but through cultural emphasis on professional excellence. When asked her secret, she always gave the same answer: hire competent people, give them clear guidance, hold them accountable, and support them when they make tough calls. Everything else is just noise. The desert was still settling when Lieutenant Kestrel Marchenko's career came full circle. Now a general officer responsible for air combat doctrine, she returned to Afghanistan as senior air power advisor during the final chaotic withdrawal. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, Taliban forces advancing faster than intelligence had predicted, American forces and Afghan allies converging on Kabul airport in desperate escape attempts. Raven found herself once again coordinating close air support missions, but this time from a command center rather than a cockpit, watching feeds from aircraft she couldn't fly, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives simultaneously. The weight was immense, the stakes higher than any single engagement, and she drew on every lesson learned across decades of service to manage the crisis unfolding on multiple screens. The irony wasn't lost on her, that the first significant combat action of her career and the last should both involve desperate ground troops calling for air support in Afghan dust storms. But the symmetry felt appropriate somehow, bookending a journey that had transformed not just her, but the institution she served. The young pilots flying those final missions didn't know her story, didn't recognize the call sign that had once been legendary. To them, she was simply the general who made decisions, allocated resources, balanced political constraints with military necessity. Raven preferred it that way, the focus remaining on the mission rather than personality. When the last aircraft lifted from Kabul, and the deployment finally ended in bittersweet evacuation rather than military victory, she felt the weight of 20 years of war settle onto her shoulders, all the lives saved and lost, the progress made and squandered, the lessons learned at costs that could never be repaid. In her final years of service before retirement, General Marchenko was often asked to reflect on her career, to provide insights for historians and journalists chronicling the evolution of women in combat. She granted few interviews, uncomfortable with retrospection that turned her experiences into narratives convenient for others' purposes. But she did authorize one comprehensive oral history, recorded over multiple sessions, meant for the archives rather than immediate publication. In those recordings, she was frank about the challenges, the discrimination both subtle and overt, the exhaustion of perpetually proving herself worthy of opportunities men received without question. But she also emphasized the growth she had witnessed, the ways the military had evolved to recognize that modern warfare demanded every capable person regardless of gender, that national security was too important to be constrained by cultural prejudices masquerading as tradition. Her retirement ceremony was attended by hundreds, representatives from every phase of her career, ground commanders whose troops she had saved, pilots she had mentored, senior leaders who had come to appreciate what she represented. Captain Torres, now himself a retired colonel, traveled across the country to attend, bringing with him a shadow box containing fragments from the MRAP destroyed in that long-ago ambush. "You saved my Marines that day," he said simply, presenting the gift. "Some of them have children now, careers, lives they wouldn't have had without you. Thank you doesn't cover it, but it's all I've got." Raven accepted the shadow box with hands that no longer flew combat aircraft, but still remembered every control input, every weapon's release, every moment when death had come close before being driven back by skill and determination. Retirement, she remained connected to the Air Force community, serving on advisory boards, mentoring young officers, occasionally lecturing at professional military education courses. But she also finally allowed herself to process the accumulated trauma of decades spent in dangerous skis, working through memories and scars with professional help she had once been too proud to seek. The nightmares diminished but never fully disappeared, combat experiences too visceral to be erased, only managed. She found peace in solitude, in the vast skis she could now watch without calculating attack angles or threat envelopes, in the knowledge that her service had mattered, that the troops she had protected had gone home to families and futures they deserved. The desert was thousands of miles away, the war officially over, but part of her would always remain in that space between earth and sky where life and death balanced on wings and weapons. The story of Raven's career lived on beyond her service, told and retold in ready rooms and academies, sometimes accurate, sometimes embellished, always carrying the essential truth that competence transcends demographic categories. Young women entering the Air Force heard her name invoked as proof that their aspirations were achievable, that the barriers others described as insurmountable could be broken through performance and persistence. Young men learned that the best pilot might not look like what tradition had conditioned them to expect, that effectiveness in combat came from skill and courage rather than conformity to outdated norms. The debates about women in combat continued in some circles, ideological positions defended against empirical evidence. But the conversations occurred in a different context now, one shaped by examples like Raven's that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Decades after that first call from the convoy in the Helmand Corridor, a historian working on a comprehensive study of close air support evolution contacted the retired general for an interview. They met at her home, a modest structure with a view of mountains that reminded her of Afghanistan's terrain without the associated trauma. The historian asked about the key moment, the decision that had defined her career and changed institutional perceptions. Raven thought carefully before answering, wanting to be precise rather than dramatic. There wasn't one moment, she finally said. Every mission was a decision, every flight an opportunity to demonstrate competence or reveal limitations. The convoy was important because it was visible, because others were watching and judging. But the real work was the accumulated weight of missions flown well, decisions made correctly, troops brought home alive. That's what changed minds, not rhetoric or policy, but consistent performance under conditions where failure had consequences. The historian pressed further, asking about the personal cost, the toll taken by decades of proving herself in environments designed to doubt her capabilities. Raven's answer was measured, acknowledging struggles without claiming victimhood, recognizing progress while noting work remaining. Every pioneer pays a price for breaking new ground. The question is whether that price purchases something valuable for those who follow. I like to think my career made it easier for the next generation of female pilots to be evaluated on merit rather than fighting battles about their right to serve. If that's my legacy, I'm content. The interview concluded with the historian thanking her for her time and service, words that Raven accepted graciously, while privately acknowledging that gratitude from civilians would always feel hollow compared to the simple "thank you" from ground troops whose lives she had saved. As evening settled over the mountains, General Kestrel Marchenko stood on her deck and watched the sky transform through its palette of colors, the same sky she had fought beneath, protected beneath, nearly died beneath. Somewhere in that vast expanse, young pilots were flying their missions, making split-second decisions, experiencing the terror and exhilaration of combat that transcended language and existed only in the moment. Some of them were women who flew with confidence that she had helped create, whose call signs carried no burden of representation, because the battles for acceptance had already been fought by those who came before. The thought brought satisfaction more profound than any medal or promotion, the knowledge that her service had made their service possible, that the institution had evolved even if incompletely, that merit was winning its long war against prejudice. The desert was still settling, would perhaps always be settling, the sand and dust of distant wars continuing to shift long after the troops came home. But in the spaces where decisions mattered, where competence determined outcomes, where excellence was recognized regardless of its source, the transformation was complete. Lieutenant Kestrel, Raven, Marchenko's lone A-10, had turned that desert into a storm of fire not through rage or recklessness, but through precision and courage, saving lives that would ripple forward through generations, changing minds that would shape institutions, proving through action what rhetoric could never accomplish. Her legacy lived in every female pilot who flew without question, every commander who evaluated based on performance, every troop who called for support knowing the response would be competent regardless of who answered. The story had become larger than its protagonist, as all important stories do, teaching lessons that transcended individual biography to illuminate universal truths about human capability and institutional evolution. And in the end, that was exactly what she had fought for. Not personal recognition, but collective progress, not her own glory, but the simple truth that the warrior's heart beats with equal strength in every chest willing to bear its weight.